5,000 years ago, Europe did not feel ancient to the people living there. It felt present, immediate, and alive with momentum. This was not a continent of ruins or forgotten tribes. It was a landscape in motion, shaped by recent revolutions in how humans lived, ate, built, and understood their place in the world. Agriculture had already transformed daily life, but its consequences were still unfolding, unevenly and often unpredictably, across forests, river valleys, coastlines, and plains. By around 3000 BCE, Europe sat at a hinge point between the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age. Stone tools still dominated everyday labor, yet metal had begun to appear, rare, precious, and symbolically powerful. Copper objects circulated along trade routes that stretch hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometers. Tin, harder to find, hinted at the coming Bronze Revolution, though for most people metal remained exotic rather than commonplace. Daily life was still defined by wood, bone, stone, clay, and muscle. The climate during this period was relatively stable and mild compared to later historical swings. Forests covered much of the continent, dense, mixed woodlands of oak, elm, lime, and hazel in the west and center, thinning into open steppe and forest steppe in the east. Human settlements did not dominate the landscape, they punctuated it. Villages were small, often housing a few dozen people, clustered near reliable water sources, fertile soils, and grazing land. Beyond the fields lay a world that was only partially controlled, forests filled with game, spirits, dangers, and unknowns. Most Europeans lived as farmers, but farming was not yet standardized. Techniques varied region by region, shaped by local soils, rainfall, inherited traditions, and trial-and-error knowledge passed orally through generations. Fields were worked with digging sticks, stone hoes, and simple plows pulled by cattle. Harvests were uncertain. A poor season could ripple outward into hunger, migration, or conflict. Survival depended not just on labor, but on deep environmental knowledge, when to plant, where to graze, how to store grain against rot, pests, and damp winters. Homes reflected this balance between permanence and vulnerability. Longhouses made of timber, wattle, and daub could last decades if maintained, yet were always one fire, flood, or abandonment away from disappearance. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds. Smoke from hearths escaped through gaps rather than chimneys, coating interiors with soot and preserving insects, seeds, and microbes that archaeologists would one day read like a diary. These houses were not just shelters, they were workshops, storerooms, and social spaces where stories, skills, and beliefs were reinforced nightly. Time itself was experienced differently. There were no written calendars, no numbered years. Instead, life was organized around cycles, day and night, moon phases, planting and harvest seasons, animal migrations, births and deaths. Large communal monuments, stone circles, timber enclosures, burial mounds, anchored memory in the landscape. They acted as reference points for ritual, identity, and continuity, linking living communities to ancestors and to forces believed to govern fertility, weather, and fate. Population was growing, but slowly. Infant mortality was high. Injuries and infections that would later be survivable often proved fatal. Average life expectancy was short, yet this statistic hides an important truth. Many individuals lived into their 40s or 50s if they survived childhood. Elders were rare but influential, serving as living archives of knowledge, knowing where to find water in drought years, how to read animal behavior, and which alliances had held or failed in the past. Crucially, Europe 5,000 years ago was not culturally uniform. Languages, customs, burial practices, and social structures varied widely across relatively short distances. Some communities emphasized collective identity, others elevated warrior elites or lineage leaders. Trade connected them, but so did tension. This was a world without borders, yet not without boundaries, territorial, symbolic, and sometimes violently enforced. This first segment sets the stage, a Europe neither primitive nor modern, but balanced on a narrow ridge between ecological intimacy and growing social complexity. In the segments that follow, we'll move closer into food, family, belief, technology, conflict, and movement to understand not just how people lived, but how it felt to exist inside a world where survival, meaning, and the landscape itself were inseparable. To live in Europe 5,000 years ago was to live inside a continuous negotiation with calories, seasons, and muscle power. Food was not an abstract concern or a background activity. It was the central organizing force of daily life. Nearly every waking hour, directly or indirectly, was tied to producing, preserving, or rationing energy. Hunger was not constant, but it was always close enough to be remembered. Agriculture had already replaced full-time foraging in much of Europe, but it was still a fragile system. Fields were small, irregular, and shaped by the land rather than imposed upon it. Forest clearing was laborious and slow. Trees were felled with stone axes polished smooth through hours of grinding, then burned or left to rot. The result was a patchwork landscape, open plots surrounded by encroaching woodland, always threatening to reclaim the work of human hands. Crops varied by region, but most communities relied on hardy cereals, early forms of wheat and barley, along with legumes such as peas and lentils. These plants were chosen not for yield alone, but for reliability. Farming was less about maximizing output and more about minimizing risk. Fields were diversified intentionally. A failed crop might be offset by another that tolerated cold, damp, or poor soil better. Monoculture as a concept would have seemed dangerously naive. Work followed the physics of the human body. There were no shortcuts. Fields were planted by hand, seeds pressed into soil one motion at a time. Weeding was constant and exhausting. Harvest required synchronized labor, cutting grain with flint sickles, bundling stalks, hauling them to threshing areas where grain was beaten free and winnowed in the wind. Every step cost calories, which meant food had to be spent in order to acquire more food. Energy budgets were tight and unforgiving. Animals were essential, but not yet abundant. Cattle provided traction for simple plows and manure for fields, but they were valuable and vulnerable. Losing a single ox could set a household back years. Sheep and goats supplied milk, wool, and meat, but grazing land was finite and competed directly with cropland. Pigs thrived near forests, converting acorns and scraps into protein, but were difficult to control. Chickens were rare. Eggs were not yet a dietary staple. Meat was not eaten daily for most people. It appeared during seasonal culls, rituals, feasts, or moments of necessity. Hunting supplemented diets, especially in forested regions, but game populations were already under pressure near settlements. Fishing was locally crucial where rivers, lakes, and coasts allowed it, and fish bones recovered from sites show careful seasonal planning. People knew when runs would come and structured labor accordingly. Food storage was the quiet backbone of survival. Grain was kept in pits, baskets, or raised platforms, sealed against moisture and rodents as best as possible. Failure here could be catastrophic. Mold, insects, or damp winters could erase an entire year's labor. This constant threat shaped behavior. Rationing was deliberate. Meals were repetitive. Waste was nearly non-existent. Bones were cracked for marrow, hides reused until they disintegrated, and plant matter composted or fed to animals. Cooking was simple but skillful. Hearths burned wood gathered from nearby forests, carefully managed to avoid depleting local supplies too quickly. Pots were handmade, thick-walled, and uneven, but remarkably durable when fired correctly. Stews dominated, slow-cooked mixtures of grain, legumes, and whatever protein was available. These meals maximized nutrient extraction and minimized fuel use. Taste mattered, but efficiency mattered more. Malnutrition was common, though rarely dramatic. Skeletons from this period show signs of nutritional stress, stunted growth, enamel defects on teeth, joint wear from repetitive labor. Yet they also show resilience. Bodies adapted. People learned which wild plants could supplement diets, which fungi were edible, which herbs eased digestion or infection. Knowledge was local, precise, and hard-earned. Children were integrated into food production early. They scared birds from fields, gathered fuel, tended animals, and learned planting rhythms by imitation rather than instruction. Skill transmission was practical, embodied, and constant. There were no manuals, only repetition and correction. Mistakes were costly, but they were also how knowledge evolved. Food was never just fuel. It carried social meaning. Feasts marked alliances, marriages, seasonal transitions, and the honoring of ancestors. Sharing surplus reinforced trust. Hoarding could fracture communities. Who controlled stored food often controlled influence, quietly shaping early social hierarchies without formal authority. By modern standards, life revolved around scarcity. By their own standards, it revolved around balance. Farming was not seen as domination of nature, but as collaboration under strict terms. The land provided, but only if approached with care, labor, and respect. Every meal was evidence that the negotiation had succeeded, at least for another day. If food was the engine of survival, family was its structure. 5,000 years ago in Europe, a person did not exist as an individual in the modern sense. Identity was embedded, woven tightly into kinship networks that determined where you lived, who you worked with, who you married, and who would support you in times of scarcity or conflict. Survival was collective, and social bonds were as essential as tools or crops. The basic household was often extended rather than nuclear. A single dwelling might contain several generations, children, parents, grandparents, and occasionally more distant relatives or unrelated individuals absorbed through marriage, alliance, or necessity. These households functioned as economic units. Labor was shared, resources pooled, and decisions made collectively or under the guidance of elders whose authority came from experience rather than formal power. Kinship was not merely biological. It was constructed and maintained through daily practice. Shared labor created obligation. Shared food created loyalty. Caring for children, the sick, and the injured reinforced bonds that were essential in a world with no external safety net. To be expelled from a kin group was not just a social punishment, it was often a death sentence. Marriage was less about romance than about strategy and continuity. Partnerships linked families, redistributed land access, and stabilized alliances. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many regions, women moved to join their partner's community, though this pattern was not universal. What mattered most was balance, ensuring that households maintained enough labor, reproductive potential, and social ties to remain viable across generations. Gender roles existed, but they were practical rather than ideological. Tasks were divided by strength, endurance, risk, and social expectation, yet these divisions were flexible when survival demanded it. Women's labor was central: planting, harvesting, food processing, textile production, childcare, and often local trade. Men typically undertook heavier clearing work, long-distance herding, and organized defense, but overlap was common. A rigid separation would have been inefficient and dangerous. Children were not sheltered from adult life. They were trained into it. From an early age, they observed and imitated the work around them, absorbing social norms through participation rather than instruction. Childhood was short, not because it was unloved, but because competence was required early. By adolescence, most individuals could perform essential tasks and were already contributing meaningfully to group survival. Elders occupied a paradoxical role. Physically, they were often worn, joints damaged, teeth lost, strength diminished. Socially, they were invaluable. In societies without writing, memory was infrastructure. Elders remembered drought years, successful planting strategies, past conflicts, and ancestral boundaries. Their authority was situational rather than absolute, but their voices carried weight, especially in times of uncertainty. Beyond the household, kinship extended outward into clans and local communities. These networks regulated access to land, water, and shared labor during peak seasons like planting and harvest. They also mediated conflict. Disputes over resources were inevitable, but violence within a community was costly. Social mechanisms, gift exchange, marriage ties, ritual reconciliation, were preferred methods of resolution when possible. Hierarchy existed, but was shallow by later standards. Leadership was often temporary and task-based. A skilled hunter, a respected mediator, or a ritual specialist might guide decisions in their domain without ruling the community as a whole. Power was persuasive rather than coercive, grounded in reputation, generosity, and perceived connection to ancestral or spiritual forces. Burial practices reveal how deeply social identity was embedded in kinship. Graves were often clustered, linking individuals across generations. Objects placed with the dead, tools, ornaments, food, signaled not wealth alone, but relationships. Who was buried near who mattered. The dead remained part of the social landscape, reinforcing continuity between past and present. Emotion, though rarely visible in the archaeological record, was not absent. Love, grief, jealousy, loyalty, and fear were constants of human life. What differed was how these emotions were expressed and managed. Individual desire was often subordinated to group stability, not through repression, but through necessity. Survival required cooperation more than self-expression. In this world, society was not an abstraction. It was built daily through shared labor, shared meals, shared risks, and shared memory. The social architecture of Europe 5,000 years ago was intimate, demanding, and resilient, designed not for growth or efficiency, but for endurance. In Europe 5,000 years ago, belief was not a separate domain of life. It was not something visited once a week or confined to specialists alone. Belief was ambient, woven into weather, land, animals, ancestry, and daily routines. Without writing, doctrine, or sacred texts, meaning was carried through practice, memory, and place. The world itself was the archive. People did not divide reality neatly into the natural and the supernatural. Forests, rivers, stones, animals, and celestial bodies were not inert backdrops, but active participants in existence. Forces that shaped harvests, health, fertility, and death were experienced directly, not theorized. A failed crop or sudden illness did not demand abstract explanation. It demanded interpretation within a living, responsive landscape. Ritual was the primary technology for engaging with uncertainty. It structured time, reduced anxiety, and reinforced social cohesion. Seasonal ceremonies marked planting, harvest, solstices, and migrations of animals. These events synchronized communities with environmental cycles they depended on but could not control. Participation mattered more than belief in the modern sense. To perform the ritual correctly was to reaffirm one's place within the collective and within the order of the world. Large communal monuments played a central role in this system of meaning. Stone circles, timber enclosures, causewayed camps, and burial mounds were not simply symbolic. They were functional nodes of memory and identity. Their construction required coordinated labor across generations, binding communities together through shared effort. Once built, they anchored stories, rituals, and genealogies to specific locations, turning landscape into narrative. Burial practices reveal a worldview oriented toward continuity rather than finality. Death was not disappearance. The dead were relocated into a different mode of presence, one that still mattered. Ancestors were often buried near settlements or revisited sites, reinforcing the idea that the living and the dead occupied overlapping worlds. Grave goods were practical as well as symbolic, suggesting that the dead retained needs, agency, or influence. Specialized ritual figures existed, though they did not resemble later priests. These individuals were often healers, diviners, or intermediaries, people believed to have heightened sensitivity to signs, dreams, animal behavior, or seasonal changes. Their authority came from perceived effectiveness rather than institutional power. If rituals failed repeatedly, trust eroded. Belief systems were pragmatic, adaptive, and locally grounded. Illness and injury were interpreted through layered explanations. Physical causes were recognized: wounds, infections, exhaustion, but these did not exclude spiritual dimensions. A sickness might reflect imbalance, broken social obligations, or offended ancestral forces. Treatments combined practical remedies, herbs, rest poultices, with ritual actions aimed at restoring harmony. Healing was both medical and social. Animals occupied a special symbolic position. They were food, labor, danger, and metaphor all at once. Certain species carried particular significance depending on region: cattle, deer, wolves, birds. Their behavior was watched closely. Migration patterns, calls, or sudden absences could be read as signals. This attentiveness was not superstition alone. It was ecological intelligence framed through meaning. The sky also mattered. The movements of the sun, moon, and stars were observed carefully, not for abstract astronomy, but for timing and reassurance. Alignments embedded in monuments suggest deliberate tracking of solstices and lunar cycles. These moments provided fixed points in an otherwise uncertain world, reinforcing the sense that time itself followed a knowable rhythm. Storytelling was the connective tissue of belief. Myths were not distant tales of gods removed from daily life. They were explanations for why the land looked the way it did, why certain rules existed, and why certain places mattered. Stories were retold constantly, shifting subtly with each generation, while preserving core meanings. Memory was collective, not archival. Importantly, belief systems were not static. They evolved as communities migrated, merged, or encountered others. New rituals were adopted, old ones abandoned. Meaning was negotiated through experience rather than preserved through text. This flexibility made belief systems resilient. They absorbed change without fracturing identity. In a world without writing, belief was not fragile. It was embodied, expressed through movement, construction, repetition, and shared attention. Meaning did not reside in words alone, but in places walked, fires tended, stones raised, and names remembered. Ritual was how people stabilized reality in a world that could never be fully controlled. 5,000 years ago, technological change did not arrive as disruption. It arrived as accumulation, small improvements layered onto familiar practices, often over generations. Innovation was cautious, local, and deeply constrained by materials, knowledge, and risk. Yet beneath this slow pace, Europe was undergoing a transformation that would eventually reorder power, labor, and identity, the earliest spread of metallurgy. For most people, stone was still king. Axes, adzes, scrapers, blades, and sickles made from flint or other knappable stones remained the backbone of daily work. These tools were not crude. Skilled knappers produced edges sharper than modern steel scalpels, optimized for specific tasks. Toolkits were highly specialized, reflecting deep understanding of material properties and wear. A broken blade could be reworked. Nothing was discarded lightly. Wood was equally essential, though far less visible archaeologically. Plows, handles, looms, carts, paddles, and containers were all wooden. Mastery of woodworking defined practical competence. Trees were selected carefully based on grain, flexibility, and resistance to rot. Joints were fitted without metal fasteners, relying on tension, wedges, and bindings. Entire technological systems existed that left little trace, once abandoned. Pottery represented another quiet but profound technology. Clay vessels expanded what could be cooked, stored, fermented, and transported. Pot shapes were not arbitrary. They reflected intended use. Wide mouths for stirring stews, narrow necks for storage, thick bases for hearth placement. Decorative patterns often doubled as cultural markers, signaling group identity across regions and generations. Metal, when it appeared, was transformative not because it was widespread, but because it was rare. Early copper tools and ornaments circulated unevenly across Europe, concentrated near sources and trade routes. Copper was softer than stone in many applications, but its symbolic power was immense. It could be reshaped, recycled, and polished to a luster unlike anything stone could achieve. Ownership of metal objects conferred status, not efficiency. The real technological shift came with the gradual discovery of alloying, mixing copper with tin to produce bronze. This knowledge did not spread instantly. Tin sources were geographically limited, and understanding the correct proportions required experimentation and transmission of specialized knowledge. Early bronze objects were precious, often reserved for weapons, ornaments, or ritual items rather than everyday tools. Metalworking itself created new social roles. Smelters and smiths controlled esoteric knowledge, how to locate ores, manage heat, and shape molten material. These skills bordered on the magical in the eyes of others. Transforming rock into liquid metal, and then into durable objects blurred the line between craft and ritual. Metallurgists often occupied ambiguous social positions, respected, feared, and sometimes set apart. Technology also reshaped movement. The wheel, already known in parts of Europe, began to see wider use in carts and wagons. This improved transport of goods, especially agricultural surplus, and heavy materials like stone or timber. Rivers remained the fastest and cheapest highways, but wheeled transport expanded the practical radius of settlements and trade. Textile technology advanced quietly but significantly. Spinning and weaving required patience, coordination, and time. Linen from flax and wool from sheep became increasingly common, replacing skins in many regions. Clothing became more durable, reparable, and adaptable to seasonal change. Loom weights and spindle whorls found in settlements speak to long hours of skilled labor, often undertaken alongside other tasks. Importantly, technological change was not evenly distributed. Neighboring communities might live with entirely different tool sets, depending on access, tradition, and trade connections. This unevenness created gradients of power and influence. Those closer to metal sources or trade networks could accumulate prestige, attract alliances, and exert subtle dominance without overt conquest. Innovation also carried risk. New tools failed. Techniques were lost. Experiments could ruin valuable resources. As a result, tradition exerted a strong gravitational pull. Old methods persisted not because people resisted change, but because survival punished reckless experimentation. By the end of this period, Europe was not yet a Bronze Age world, but it was no longer purely Neolithic either. It existed in overlap, where stone and metal, old knowledge and new techniques, coexisted in fragile balance. Technology did not revolutionize life overnight, but it quietly set the conditions for deeper social stratification, expanded trade, and new forms of conflict. 5,000 years ago, Europe had no maps, no passports, and no political borders, yet was far from isolated. Long-distance movement of people, materials, and ideas was already reshaping the continent. Trade was not an abstract economic system. It was a web of personal relationships, seasonal journeys, and inherited routes that stitched distant communities together long before written history. Most travel was slow and purposeful. People did not wander aimlessly. Movement followed rivers, coastlines, ridgelines, and known clearings, paths reinforced by repetition rather than construction. A journey of even 50 kilometers was significant, undertaken for marriage, exchange, ritual gathering, or necessity. Travel carried risk, injury, illness, hostile encounters, or becoming lost in unfamiliar terrain. As a result, routes were conservative, and knowledge of them was valuable. Rivers were the arteries of Europe. The Danube, Rhine, Elbe, Rhone, and countless smaller waterways enabled movement of bulk goods far more efficiently than overland travel. Dugout canoes, simple but effective, carried people, grain, hides, stone, and metal along these corridors. Settlements near navigable water enjoyed disproportionate access to trade, information, and influence. Trade goods reveal the scale of these connections. Obsidian from volcanic regions appears hundreds of kilometers from its source. Amber from the Baltic coast traveled deep into Central and Southern Europe. Jadeite axes from the Alps were transported across vast distances, often unused, suggesting symbolic rather than practical value. These objects were not commodities in the modern sense. They were carriers of meaning, alliance, and obligation. Exchange was rarely impersonal. Goods moved through gift-giving, reciprocal obligation, and long-standing relationships rather than open markets. To trade was to establish trust. Breaking that trust had consequences that extended far beyond material loss. Reputation traveled as surely as objects did, shaping who could access which networks. Trade also moved ideas. Farming techniques, pottery styles, burial customs, and ritual practices diffused along the same routes as materials. This created cultural gradients rather than sharp boundaries. Neighboring regions might share tool forms but differ in belief, or share rituals but use distinct technologies. Europe became a mosaic of overlapping influences rather than isolated cultures. Migration played a parallel role. People moved for many reasons: environmental stress, population pressure, conflict, or opportunity. Some migrations were gradual, spreading over generations. Others were abrupt, triggered by collapse or advantage elsewhere. These movements introduced new languages, genetic lineages, and social practices into existing communities, sometimes blending peacefully, sometimes generating tension. The emergence of wheeled transport expanded these dynamics. Carts drawn by cattle allowed heavier loads to move across land, albeit slowly. This did not replace river travel, but it extended trade networks into interior regions previously limited by terrain. Over time, this increased interdependence between communities with different ecological strengths. Trade networks also produced inequality. Not everyone had equal access to valuable goods or distant connections. Individuals or families positioned at crossroads, geographic or social, could accumulate prestige by controlling exchange. This prestige was often displayed subtly: rare ornaments, exotic materials, or participation in distant rituals rather than overt wealth. Conflict and trade were closely linked. Exchange created incentives for cooperation, but also for competition. Control of routes, resources, or strategic settlements could provoke violence. Yet full-scale warfare was rare compared to later periods. The cost of sustained conflict was too high for small, interdependent communities. Most tensions were managed through displays, raids, or negotiated boundaries rather than annihilation. Importantly, travel reshaped how people understood the world. For most individuals, life remained local, but knowledge of distant places existed through stories, objects, and returning travelers. The world felt larger than the village, yet still knowable through relational chains. Europe was not perceived as a continent, but as a connected landscape of familiar routes fading into uncertainty. By 3000 BCE, Europe was already interconnected enough that changes in one region could ripple outward: new technologies, new crops, new social structures. Trade and travel did not erase local identity, but they ensured that no community existed in isolation for long. 5,000 years ago, Europe existed without armies, police, or centralized governments, yet it was not a peaceful utopia. Violence was real, personal, and consequential. At the same time, cooperation was essential and constant. The absence of formal states did not mean the absence of order. It meant that order had to be continuously maintained through relationships, reputation, and restraint. Conflict most often arose from pressure rather than ideology. Disputes over land, water, livestock, marriage arrangements, or access to trade routes could escalate quickly when resources were scarce or populations grew. Environmental stress, drought, flooding, or failed harvests magnified these tensions. In a world with limited surplus, even small disruptions could push communities toward confrontation. Archaeological evidence shows that interpersonal violence was not uncommon. Skeletal remains bear marks of healed fractures, embedded arrowheads, and blunt force trauma. These injuries suggest episodic conflict rather than constant warfare, raids, ambushes, or retaliatory attacks rather than prolonged campaigns. Violence was usually local and short-lived because sustaining large-scale fighting would have been economically ruinous. Weapons reflected this reality. Tools and weapons often overlapped. Axes, spears, clubs, and bows served both productive and destructive roles. There was little specialization. A farmer might also be a defender. Early metal weapons existed, but most people still fought with stone, wood, and bone. Skill and familiarity mattered more than material superiority. Settlements adapted accordingly. Some villages were placed on defensible terrain, hilltops, peninsulas, or areas with natural barriers like rivers and marshes. Others incorporated simple fortifications, ditches, palisades, or earthen embankments. These were not impregnable defenses but deterrents, signaling that a community was organized and prepared to resist. Yet cooperation often outweighed conflict. Large communal projects, monuments, forest clearing, seasonal harvests, required coordination beyond individual households. Even neighboring groups with histories of tension might collaborate when mutual survival depended on it. Feasting, marriage alliances, and ritual gatherings acted as pressure valves, diffusing hostility and reaffirming shared norms. Social mechanisms for managing violence were crucial. Feuds could spiral, but they were usually constrained by kinship networks and the knowledge that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally. Compensation, reconciliation rituals, or enforced separation were common responses to wrongdoing. The goal was restoration, not punishment in the modern sense. Importantly, violence carried social cost. Individuals who acted unpredictably or excessively risked isolation. Reputation functioned as a form of governance. A known aggressor might find trade denied, marriages refused, or assistance withheld during hardship. This social enforcement limited escalation more effectively than coercive institutions could have. Warfare, when it occurred, was as much psychological as physical. Displays of strength, weaponry, numbers, defensive construction were meant to discourage attack without bloodshed. Actual combat was dangerous and unpredictable, with high risk of injury or death even for the victorious. Avoidance was often the rational choice. Children grew up aware of this reality. They learned not only practical skills but social boundaries, where it was safe to travel, which groups were friendly, which places carried risk. Stories of past conflicts were preserved not to glorify violence, but to warn and instruct. The absence of centralized authority did not mean chaos. It meant that order emerged from balance. Communities survived by calibrating aggression carefully, enough to defend resources and deter threats, but not so much that it fractured the networks they depended on. By this point in the story, Europe appears neither idyllic nor brutal, but constrained. Violence existed, yet it was bounded by necessity and consequence. Cooperation was not moral idealism, it was survival logic. To live in Europe 5,000 years ago was to live with the body as an ever-present fact. There was no meaningful separation between health, labor, survival, and identity. The body was not optimized or protected. It was used, stressed, injured, healed when possible, and ultimately worn down. Physical experience shaped how people understood time, risk, and their own limits. Birth was both common and dangerous. Pregnancy carried significant risk, and childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. There were no sterile environments, no surgical interventions, and no reliable ways to manage complications. Knowledge of childbirth was passed through experience, supported by other women in the community who had survived it themselves. Success depended on position, strength, luck, and social support. Infant mortality was high. Many children did not survive their first years due to infection, malnutrition, or environmental exposure. This did not mean children were unloved or emotionally distant. On the contrary, their loss was deeply felt. But emotionally, communities adapted. Grief existed alongside an understanding that survival was uncertain and never guaranteed. Those who survive childhood often develop robust physical resilience. Diet, constant movement, and exposure to the elements shaped strong bones and muscles, though often at the cost of long-term wear. Skeletal remains show early-onset arthritis, joint degeneration, and repetitive stress injuries, particularly in shoulders, knees, and spines. Life was physically demanding from an early age, and the body carried that history visibly. Injury was common, and not always fatal. Broken bones often healed, sometimes imperfectly. People lived with chronic pain, reduced mobility, and lingering impairment. Social structures adapted to this reality. An injured adult might shift roles rather than be discarded, moving from heavy labor to childcare, tool maintenance, food processing, or knowledge transmission. Survival required flexibility, not efficiency. Illness was understood experientially rather than diagnostically. Infections, parasites, dental disease, and nutritional deficiencies were common. Tooth decay and abscesses could be deadly. Herbal knowledge provided limited relief. Certain plants eased pain, reduced inflammation, or slowed infection, but outcomes were unpredictable. Healing was as much about care and rest as it was about remedies. Aging was gradual but visible. Few reached what we would consider old age, but those who did were marked by physical decline rather than sudden frailty. Elders often walked with difficulty, had missing teeth, and reduced strength, yet remained socially central. Their continued survival was itself evidence of communal support. Keeping elders alive required effort, and that effort reinforced the value placed on memory and experience. There was no concept of retirement. Contribution continued as long as possible. Productivity was not measured by output alone, but by usefulness. Someone who could no longer hunt or farm might still teach, mediate disputes, tend fires, or care for children. The body's limitations reshaped social roles rather than ending them. Pain was a constant background condition. Without modern analgesics, people developed high tolerance and pragmatic attitudes toward discomfort. Pain was expected, managed, and endured rather than eliminated. This did not make people indifferent to suffering, but it framed it as part of existence rather than an aberration. Death was familiar. It occurred in the home, the field, the forest. Bodies were prepared by the living, not professionals. This intimacy with death shaped belief systems and emotional resilience. Mortality was not hidden. It was integrated into daily awareness. The human body, in this world, was not an abstract biological machine. It was the medium through which all knowledge, labor, and meaning passed. Strength mattered, but endurance mattered more. Survival favored those who could adapt their bodies and expectations to an unforgiving environment. 5,000 years ago, permanence was an aspiration, not a guarantee. Settlements were built to last, fields were cleared with the hope of inheritance, and burial grounds anchored memory to place, but none of this ensured continuity. Across prehistoric Europe, communities periodically abandoned their homes, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly. Migration was not failure. It was a survival strategy woven into the human relationship with land. Environmental pressure was a constant driver. Soil fertility declined under repeated cultivation, forests retreated or returned unpredictably, and climate variability could destabilize carefully balanced systems. A sequence of poor harvests might force families to disperse, split, or seek more reliable ground. Archaeological layers show villages occupied for generations, then suddenly left behind, tools, pottery, and structures dissolving back into the landscape. Population growth also created strain. As communities expanded, competition for arable land intensified. Marginal areas were cultivated, yields fell, and conflict became more likely. Migration relieved pressure without requiring sustained violence. Younger generations often moved first, establishing new settlements within known cultural and trade spheres, carrying traditions forward while adapting them to new environments. Conflict could accelerate these movements. Raids, feuds, or persistent tension made some locations untenable. In such cases, leaving was safer than defending indefinitely. Fortifications might delay abandonment, but they could not compensate for isolation, depleted resources, or hostile neighbors. Migration preserved people even when places were lost. Trade networks both enabled and influenced movement. Knowledge of distant lands traveled through exchange. Stories of fertile valleys, accessible waterways, or resource-rich regions circulated long before settlers arrived. Migration followed information. It was rarely blind. Groups moved along familiar routes or toward areas already connected through kinship or trade. Archaeogenetic evidence reveals that these movements were significant. Entire populations shifted over centuries, introducing new genetic lineages, languages, and social structures. These changes were not always violent invasions. Often they were absorptions, intermarriages, and gradual cultural blending. Identity was flexible enough to survive transformation. Collapse, when it occurred, was local rather than civilizational. There was no fall of Europe, only the end of particular lifeways in particular places. A farming system that worked for centuries could fail under new conditions. A ritual center could lose relevance. A trade route could dry up. Communities responded pragmatically, by adapting or by leaving. Importantly, abandonment did not mean erasure. Sacred sites were often revisited long after daily life ceased. Burial grounds continued to attract offerings. Memory outlived occupation. People carried stories of old places into new ones, preserving identity even as geography changed. Migration also reshaped belief and social structure. New environments demanded new rituals, new agricultural rhythms, and new alliances. Old traditions were tested against new realities. Some persisted, others faded. Cultural evolution was accelerated by movement. This fluidity challenges modern assumptions about stability. For prehistoric Europeans, resilience meant knowing when to stay and when to go. Attachment to land was deep, but not absolute. Survival required the willingness to abandon even carefully built worlds when conditions turned against them. To live well in Europe 5,000 years ago did not mean comfort, abundance, or safety in the modern sense. It meant endurance without collapse, continuity without certainty, and meaning without written explanation. A good life was one that held together, where people survived seasonal risk, raised children who reached adulthood, honored their dead, and passed on knowledge strong enough to persist when conditions changed. Well-being was measured collectively. An individual could suffer, but a household needed to endure. A harvest might fail, but the community had to adapt. Success was not defined by growth or accumulation, but by stability across generations. If the land continued to feed people, if kin networks held, and if rituals still made sense of the world, then life was considered viable. Time moved slowly, but not aimlessly. People planned for seasons, not decades. The future existed as expectation rather than projection. There was no concept of progress as an abstract force, yet change was constant. New tools appeared. New people arrived. Old customs were revised or abandoned. Continuity came not from resisting change, but from absorbing it without losing coherence. Knowledge was embodied rather than stored. Skills lived in hands, eyes, and memory. A successful life meant becoming competent, learning when to plant, how to build, how to heal, how to negotiate conflict, how to read weather and landscape. Intelligence was practical, situational, and deeply local. Wisdom meant knowing limits as much as possibilities. Meaning was anchored to place, but not confined by it. Sacred sites mattered because they concentrated memory, not because they excluded other meanings. Identity was layered, household, kin group, region, ancestry, flexible enough to survive migration and intermarriage. Belonging was reinforced through participation rather than belief alone. There was little illusion of control. People understood that nature could undo their work without warning. This produced neither fatalism nor arrogance, but attentiveness. The world was watched closely. Subtle changes mattered. Adaptation was not heroic, it was routine. From a modern perspective, life appears precarious. From within that world, it was normal. People calibrated their expectations to reality. They did not expect ease, but they expected continuity. That expectation shaped resilience. Many structures of that world still echo faintly today. Our attachment to place, our rituals around birth and death, our instinct to cooperate under pressure, and our tendency to measure success socially rather than individually all trace back to these deep patterns. Even modern systems, economies, institutions, technologies rest on assumptions forged in environments where survival depended on trust, memory, and adaptation. Europe 5,000 years ago was not waiting for history to begin. It was already dense with it, layered with choices, failures, recoveries, and quiet successes that never entered written record. The people of that world were not primitive ancestors stumbling forward blindly. They were skilled, perceptive, and deeply embedded in the constraints they understood better than we ever could. To study how they lived is not to romanticize the past. It is to recognize a form of intelligence shaped by limits, one that prioritized balance over growth, continuity over expansion, and meaning over certainty.